Thomas Aquinas was a philosopher of the 13th century, of the High Middle Ages, and indeed his work represents something like a high water mark in terms of the synthesis that he creates from ancient philosophical wisdom and the Christian tradition of which he was a part. In some ways, his work is cathedral-like itself, just in its largeness and in its subtlety, in its attention to detail. So what were his influences and how did he create the synthesis that he did create? What are its characteristics? Well, Aquinas was influenced by the great Boethius, by Augustine, but he pushes beyond them in a number of ways. You know, despite the fact that Boethius had translated Aristotle's logical texts, his logical works, Aristotle's corpus was fairly lost to the West during the Middle Ages, and so Western Christian philosophy tended to be dominated by, formed by, the kind of Neoplatonic influences that shaped Augustine's and Boethius's thought. Aquinas himself accepts this Neoplatonized Christianity as well by degrees, but by the 13th century, there had been a reintroduction, an influx of Aristotle's metaphysics, of his ethics, of the entire Aristotelian corpus, principally by way of the Muslim philosophers who had preserved and translated and offered important commentaries on Aristotle's work. So Aquinas then becomes the beneficiary of this. He becomes a recipient of all of Aristotle's work. He digs into it and is able to create a synthesis of Neoplatonism, of Aristotelianism, and of Christianity in a way that hadn't really been done before. So Aquinas accepts the overall history of the world, the philosophy of history that Augustine had developed in his City of God. But he does make a few tweaks to Augustine's account of human nature. So remember, Augustine, being influenced by the Neoplatonists, thinks of the human person as having a soul, and more than that, thinks of the human person as almost being identical to the soul, so that the soul is the real locus or bearer of individuality for Augustine. Aquinas, in his reading of Aristotle, tweaks this point of view and says that in point of fact, souls and bodies need to be understood as more integrated. So you are, according to Aquinas, an animal. You are an animal who's informed by a rational principle, a rational aspect, or a rational soul. But the rational soul is not you. You are the thing or the animal that is informed by the rational soul. So you see, he goes from the sort of Platonic perspective back to the Aristotelian perspective that had sort of been lost during the stretch of time between Augustine and Aquinas. However, you'll remember that according to Aristotle, since the soul is the form of the body, and forms can't exist apart from the matter that they inform or in which they inhere, you can't have life after death. You know, it's understandable why, from a Christian point of view, Boethius and Augustine and the others would be attracted to the Platonic picture over against Aristotle's picture, because Plato does allow for disembodied existence, life after death. So here again, Aristotle gets tweaked by Aquinas, just as Aquinas had tweaked the picture that Augustine hands down. He does it in this way. According to Aquinas, the rational soul that informs the body and goes together to make the compound which is you, the individual human person, is itself a subsistent entity. That means that it's not a generic essence, but it's actually individual and individually subsistent in such a way that it is capable of existing after the death of the body. In other words, he alters Aristotle's picture so as to allow for life after death, as his Christianity looks to require. But you got to be careful here, because you might think of Aquinas' view of life after death as being pretty odd from a Christian perspective. This is because, again, it isn't you that survives the death of your body. It's the rational part of you. The rational part of you is no more you than, for example, your body is. Remember, you're a body-soul composite. So in your disembodied existence after death, you are a kind of partial thing. You exist in a kind of hazy, defective way. You're in a real sense half the man that you used to be. That might sound a little bit strange from a Christian point of view, but as a matter of fact, I think it's to be expected. It might sound odd from a contemporary and kind of popular version of Christianity, but it certainly doesn't sound odd from Aquinas' point of view. That's because, as you'll recall, the eschatological focus of Christianity is on the body, and the spiritual as well, but not spiritual in contradistinction to or over against the body. So the focus is on the integration of heaven and earth, body and soul. It's not focused on leaving the physical world and the spiritual to the exclusion of the body. Remember, if death is the separation of the soul and the body, and death is itself a curse, a consequence of sin, it's not something that God had in mind for rational creatures. It's not God's end game to see to it that your soul is divorced from your body. Rather, that's an unnatural state of existence for you. And so it stands to reason that to the extent that you exist at all outside of a body, you exist in a very subpar kind of defective mode, awaiting the perfection of existence that entails the reintegration of body and soul. So that's an important way in which Aquinas takes over the classical philosophy together with the Christian tradition that he'd been handed and reorients it, I think, towards a more sort of classically Abrahamic or Hebraic outlook. There's another way as well that Aquinas takes up the Aristotelian framework and Christianizes it. And it concerns what Aristotle has to say about the end or the goal of human being. So remember, for Aristotle, the end of human being is happiness. The end of the human being is eudaimonia, to flourish, and so forth. So there's a way in which the natural virtues of temperance, fortitude, and so forth enter into the good life, to the happy life of the individual, leading towards the flourishing or full flowering of human potential. Aquinas takes up this picture and endorses in broad outline Aristotle's view of practical wisdom, of the virtues, and of the natural end of human beings as being directed towards eudaimonia. However, Aquinas adds an additional supernatural level or layer to his account of the end of man. So what he says is that the end or the goal of human beings needs to be distinguished into the natural end, which is described by Aristotle, and man's supernatural end. The supernatural end of man is the beatific vision. It lies in the love and intimate communion had with and through God, who is the beginning and the end of all things. How do you attain this end? Well, along the model that he uses with respect to the natural end of human beings, the virtues enter into the story here, but they're a different set of virtues. The natural virtues lead to or are related to, with eudaimonia, flourishing. The supernatural virtues are the virtues that lead to or are related to the beatific vision, the supernatural virtues of faith, of hope and love, or charity. Now, these things are not natural virtues because they come to us adventitiously by way of the operation of the Holy Spirit through the ministry of the city of God or the church. And it's the bestowal, the presentation of these gifts that lead to the kinds of dispositions, habits, and so forth that are then able to transform the individual sort of bottom up, inside out, so that they are made capable of sharing union and communion, love with God and the saints and the life everlasting. So again, what you see in Aquinas is you see a gathering up of the Neoplatonic elements that had so influenced his forebears, all of the Aristotelian elements that he sees as right and as good and as synthesizable with the overall traditional Christian worldview that he begins his philosophy with and through which he transforms philosophy.